Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics of the Walter White character from the series Breaking Bad. So Breaking Bad was a series that ran from 2008 to 2013, had 5 seasons, 62 episodes, and there's also a movie that came out in 2019 that kind of extended Breaking Bad, named El Camino. So this is a good point to issue a spoiler alert for the entire series, Breaking Bad, and for the movie El Camino. So I'll go through a summary of the series, then take a look at the development of the character, Walter White, and then give my opinions on the series. So first, the summary. I think that what made Breaking Bad special was really the character development and the general progression of the show. The tone really grew darker as the series progressed. When we first meet Walter White, he's somewhat melancholy, maybe just a little sad, non-assertive. He's a high school chemistry teacher who works part-time at a car wash. He's bored with what seems like an ordinary life. He seems to have an interest in a more exciting life, or at least an interest in the prospect of making a lot of money. And we find out later that he blew his big opportunity for fame and fortune when he sold the share of a company that he co-founded for $5,000, and that company would later on earn billions in revenue. We see that Walter is diagnosed with stage 3A lung cancer and given about 2 years to live. And this seems to be the impetus for Walter to develop the dark side of his personality and chase fantasies that we'd never dreamed of. Initially, of course, his reasons for getting involved in crime would be to support his family, to make sure his family was cared for after he was gone. So the series follows his exploits through learning about a life of crime, specifically how to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine, while at the same time acknowledging and accepting his own mortality, the consequences of his choices, and we see all these decaying relationships that he has with his family members and associates. We see the series takes on heavy content fairly early, not just with the diagnosis of cancer, but with Walt committing murder and eventually Jesse committing murder as well. Walt's life of crime intensifies. He commits more murders, he makes more money, and he faces increasingly severe consequences and complications because of his behavior. Toward the end, we see that Walt is unable to maintain really any meaningful relationships. He's on the run from the law, and in the last episode takes revenge on the people that killed his brother-in-law, Hank Schrader, who of course works for the DEA. Now, Hank was killed because of Walt's behavior, although Walt didn't really seem to intend that to happen. And of course, Hank was killed because of some of the mistakes he made as well, like not telling the DEA about his investigation into Walt. Also near the end, we see that Walter arranges to kill Jesse, his on-again, off-again partner in crime. And we see that cancer does not ultimately kill Walt. Rather, he's killed by a round from an M60 machine gun that he took to the abdomen, which was remotely fired by him to kill his adversaries. So at the very end, we see that his brother-in-law is dead. His wife Skylar is left with legal problems from her involvement in laundering Walt's money. His son, Walt Jr., or Flynn, hates him. His partner Jesse and his attorney Saul are on the run from the law, although we see that things work out for Jesse in the movie El Camino, right? Eventually they work out. So really, essentially, Walt leaves a trail of destruction. So now taking a look at the character development of Walter White. So Walt's character progresses in a number of ways across many dimensions. I'm going to analyze the progression from 3 points of view, which of course have some overlap between them. His progression through psychopathology and the changes in his personality we see during the series. His changes in terms of morality and values, the different way he approaches the moral struggles of his life of crime, and the changes in how he relates to other people, how he manages relationships. So first, taking a look at the mental health and personality. Early in the series, we see that Walt appears to be mildly depressed, bored, stuck in a routine, and he appears to have low self-esteem. There's some hint at obsessive-compulsive personality traits, like being somewhat rigid and perfectionistic. He's careful in how he plans things and tries to minimize risk, including his involvement with the manufacturing of substances. But then Walter becomes increasingly ambitious and at the same time increasingly impulsive, making decisions based on emotions, like arguing with the police officer who pulled him over for the broken windshield, or lighting a brand new car on fire in a parking lot. We see a lot of evidence that supports the idea that Walt has obsessive-compulsive personality traits, like the fact that he is disgusted by Jesse's imprecise behavior, and of course that episode with the fly, kind of a controversial episode in the series, because I think it was so slow-moving. But it really did illustrate the point with his obsessions. Now we see that he slowly develops dark triad traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. With narcissism, we see that he develops a sense of entitlement. He wants to have control over everything. He doesn't want to split money with anybody else. He wants to have it his way, be the boss. We see that he's arrogant and demands admiration. For example, that famous episode where he wants the other criminals there to say his name, Heisenberg, the name he uses. He has fantasies of success and power. So we see this episode where he talks to Jesse about how he's really not in the business of making money or substances, but rather Walt wants to build an empire. We see evidence of psychopathy in his lying behavior. He lies so much in the series it's really hard to keep track of them all, especially to his family. We see sensation-seeking, like leasing the Chrysler 300 and driving fast, as well as impulsive and aggressive behavior, like getting into a physical fight with Jesse. Now, in terms of Machiavellianism, we see he becomes highly effective at manipulation, including his risky manipulation of Jesse, involving that poison, to get Jesse's help in challenging Gus. We see that he develops some level of impulse control, right? So he has impulsivity, but he also learns to control some impulses, like planting the ricin in order to kill Lydia and building that rig for the M60 so he can take out his adversaries in the end. So diagnostically speaking, this gets kind of tricky. The diagnoses that Walt would be eligible for, namely narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, are not a good fit based on what we know of his early history, which of course is not much, but they're an excellent fit for how we see him toward the end of the series. The audience is led to believe that Walt was a straight shooter before turning to a life of crime. He evidently wasn't narcissistic or psychopathic, but if we put this aside and we don't consider what he may have been like before we first see him in the series, then he would likely meet the full criteria for both narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Another real possibility, of course, is obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD. There's this idea that he may have had this the whole time. The obsessive-compulsive traits perhaps are not new. We're just seeing them in a different way as Walt goes through all these different adventures. The traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder appear to be new. Well, that covers the mental health, but what about Walt's personality? I'm going to map his personality using the 5-factor model. So I remember this through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So in terms of openness to experience, Walt has moderate to low openness to experience. He's intellectually curious, and he does get more adventurous toward the end of the series, but in general, he doesn't tend to think abstractly. He tends to have kind of rigid thinking. Now, in terms of conscientiousness, he's highly conscientious, which of course wouldn't be a surprise if he was eligible for obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. We see these deliberate, organized, and he likes things to run on a schedule. In terms of extroversion, we see here he's mid-range or low. He tends to work well alone. He doesn't mind staying to himself, but he can also be sociable when required. Now, in terms of agreeableness, this is also interesting. Early on, we see he's around mid-range, maybe a little bit low, but of course toward the end he becomes quite disagreeable. His lack of trust in particular tends to stand out. Although, to be fair, his lack of trust serves him well. In his line of work, having a lack of trust actually makes sense. A lot of people were trying to get him, although I think his antagonism caused a lot of that as well. Now, with neuroticism, this one also is a little bit difficult to really nail down throughout the series. I would say that most of the time he had mid-range neuroticism, but there are definitely times when he seems to be more subject to feelings of depression, anxiety, and anger. Anger really tends to stand out here for Walt. So that takes care of mental health and personality. What about morality and values? Well, we see initially that Walt doesn't really seem to like the life of crime. It's miserable. It's a dirty business. He goes out of his way to avoid confrontation. He's constantly reminded about how his choices are immoral, especially considering that Hank, his brother-in-law, is a DEA agent. Walt commits a lot of criminal offenses, but his changing attitudes toward morality can really be explored best, I think, by looking specifically at the many murders that he committed. That's not the only area of moral change, but I think it's important. It's also important to mention that we don't know how many people really died from the substance use, right? Walt was manufacturing methamphetamine. That, of course, would cause death. And also, on top of that, other people probably were indirectly harmed by Walt in other ways, right, in his other criminal dealings. So a lot of death and destruction before we even get to the murders that he directly participated in. So moving back to early in the series, we see that his first killing was really self-defense. He used phosphine gas to affect two people that were probably going to kill him. One of them dies immediately, and one survives. The one that survived goes by the name Crazy 8, and we see that he lives initially, and Walt has kind of a moral dilemma about whether he should kill Crazy 8 or not, and really chooses to let him go, but then finds out that Crazy 8 was planning to kill Walt. So Walt knows that if he releases Crazy 8, then Walt is going to die. So we see kind of a tough moral situation. Of course, he could have just stopped at any time and called the police, but that doesn't seem to be an option for him the way he's thinking. So eventually he decides to kill Crazy 8. This was, of course, murder, but again, there's a dilemma created here so that we don't necessarily think Walt is a terrible person at this point, right? The audience is a little bit torn by that particular murder. I think the big turning point was when he watched Jane die, right? So we see that Jane and Jesse are in the bed, and Walt makes contact with Jesse physically, and Jane kind of falls over on her back, and then she vomits and starts choking on that vomit. And of course, Walt could have easily saved her life, but he chose not to. For a few different reasons. She was blackmailing him, and she was kind of tearing Jesse away from him, so he was losing his partner. So we see in that moment that we kind of expect Walt to do what he did, right? He's looking at Jane, choking, and we see he's a little bit torn, but I think most people watching probably believed Walt was going to let her die. But even still, this act was surprising. So you kind of expect it, and it's surprising at the same time. This is when Walt really begins his descent into evil and reaches a tipping point. The die is cast. There's no return for Walter now. And this is punctuated in the series by this cascade of events from Jane's death to the plane crash that kills 167 people. So really highlighting the significance of this particular decision. So after this, killing becomes a lot easier for Walter. We see that he kills two of Gus's dealers. Both were run over. One he shot after he ran him over. This was first-degree murder. He did it to protect Jesse and maybe some other reasons as well, maybe his own self-interest. We see next, essentially he kills Gail. He orders Jesse to kill Gail. He did it to protect himself and Jesse. This one's a little bit trickier, but still definitely murder. We see next he kills Gus, Tio, and Tyrus with an explosion. He planted the explosive that killed them. He did it to protect himself, yes, but it was still first-degree murder. We see after this he kills two of Gus's nameless guards to save Jesse and to destroy the lab. The next murder was of Mike, Gus's main enforcer. We see that Mike wouldn't give Walter information on 9 of Gus's employees who knew too much. He wouldn't provide the identities to Walt. Murdering Mike really didn't help Walt to get the information, although it may have prevented revenge, like Mike might have come back and killed Walt after Walt killed those 9 people. So this murder is a little bit murky as well, but again, definitely murder. We see that then Walt kills those 9 employees, plus Mike's attorney, who is a liability to Walt as well, in this really sophisticated orchestrated hit, but it was other people that carried out the murders. Walt was the ringleader and didn't do much except paying the money, but still it kind of made him out to be more or less like the Godfather, like a mafia figure. Next we see that Walt causes the death of Hank Schrader and Steve Gomez. Both of course work for the DEA. Hank's Walt's brother-in-law, and at the same time orders Jesse to be killed. So that was really another turning point. We see that Walt was very upset that Hank was murdered, and he was upset at Jesse, and that's why he ordered Jesse to be killed. So we see kind of another level of moral breakdown for Walt. He has remorse about Hank, though, and that's important, and I think that plays a part in his final killings. So next we see this gang that was holding Jesse. This was not technically Walt's last murder, Lydia would be, but it's his last kind of big move in the series. We see that he mounts an M60 to this rig that moves it back and forth, kind of does this elaborate thing by putting it in his trunk and then ducking as he remotely activates the M60 and wipes out most everybody with that machine gun. And of course, Lydia dies after this because Walt poisoned her a little bit before this. He carried out this murder of the gang essentially to avenge Hank and also to free Jesse. So from Walt's point of view, it was kind of twisted at the end, of course, but maybe he felt from his perspective he was doing something good. He was kind of setting things right through those final murders, creating an environment where, again, Hank was avenged and where Jesse could be free. And then we move to the last murder, which technically would be Walt himself. So it probably wasn't his intent to get hit by one of the M60 rounds, but he knew that was going to be his last big move. He went there knowing that that attack, in one sense or another, would cost him his life. He wasn't going to die of the cancer, but rather he was going to die that night. So we see kind of the destructiveness of Walt's behavior and his transformation in terms of morality really comes to this final point where all is lost, again, including his own life. So that covers morality. Now moving to Walt's relationships. Well, we see he has a number of key relationships in the series. I'm not really touching on everybody he knew or interacted with, but the characters that I believe are really central to kind of analyzing the changes in Walt. I'll start with Walt Jr. We see that in the beginning, Walt Jr. supports and loves Walt. Really, he's his biggest fan, and eventually, of course, comes to hate him. He hangs up on him toward the very end. Skylar, his wife, we see that she loves him in the beginning, but then develops a fear for him, a distrust for him, and eventually hatred. At the very end, we see that she softens up a little, really a very little, but mostly, I think, still hates Walt right through his death. Then we have Hank. Hank's a big fan. He likes Walt, thinks of him as a bit quirky and unusual, but they get along. Then we see toward the end, he wants Walt to be in prison for life. Now, what's interesting about the relationship with Hank, of course, is it all hinges on Hank finding that Walt Whitman book. The book that Walter White left in his own bathroom. Hank was using the bathroom, finds that book. So this becomes kind of on or off, right? Hank liked him, and then he didn't, right? It was very sudden. So we don't really see the gradual progression with Hank as we do with many of the other characters. Moving on to Saul, Walt's attorney, we see that in the beginning, Saul kind of tolerates Walt after Walt and Jesse were going to kill Saul. He learns to tolerate him after that. But then he actually walks out on him in the end, right? Saul goes to live in Nebraska, and Walt was left alone until eventually he goes to New Hampshire before the very end of the series. Next we have Gus. I think Gus respected Walt. He liked the fact that Walt was organized and careful. He did not respect Walt's choice of partners in Jesse. But either way, we see that Gus moves from this position to wanting Walt dead. Kind of a popular position for a lot of characters in the series. Similarly, we see Mike. I don't think Mike really ever liked Walt, but again, by the end, he really tends to hate him. And what I find really interesting here with Mike is at the very end, of course, we see that Walt shoots him, but Mike's still alive. He's dying. And he's annoyed even at that point, even in his own death, as he's dying. He's annoyed at Walt and asks Walt just to let him die in peace, right? So that's how bad Walt was. Even in the end, as Mike was dying, he didn't want to hear anything from Walt. He was just that annoyed with him. He didn't want to get revenge or say something impolite. He just wanted Walt to leave him alone. I think that was an important scene in terms of like really figuring out how badly the characters hated Walt. And that brings me to the last relationship I'll cover with Walt, which of course is Jesse, which I think is really the crucial relationship for Walt in the series. He's confused by Walt early on. Why is he doing this? Why does this chemistry teacher want to help create substances and get into crime? But he maintains respect for Walt through most of the series. And we see really through the entire series he refers to Walt as Mr. White. Now, Walt was always hard on Jesse, but I think he loved him. And we see additional evidence of this in the El Camino movie a little bit. There was a small degree of affection. Walt wanted Jesse to have a future. I think before the love formed for Walt toward Jesse, He really needed Jesse. I think that's where they kind of started. He saw Jesse as an important ally. And out of that need and other things that were going on, he grew to really have an affection toward him. Now, he manipulates Jesse into helping him with that whole thing with the poison. He orders Jesse to be taken out at the end, of course, but he tells him the truth in that scene about Jane. So in a sense, Walt has some level of respect, even as he thinks he's doing something that's going to cause Jesse's death. And of course, ultimately, we see that Walt saves Jesse. Although I think an important motivator for killing that gang was revenge, because they killed Hank. But either way, that action does save Jesse. And it gives Jesse an opportunity to kill him, right? Because he knows Jesse's angry at him. So in a sense, he wants to make things right with Jesse. He wants an absolution as well. And of course, we see that Jesse does not give that to him. And ultimately, of course, Walt dies from that round from the M60. So my thoughts on the show, right? So I thought that Breaking Bad was really excellent. It was an excellent show. It was well acted, well written. It had kind of creative angles with the camera, which sometimes were good and sometimes weren't, but in general I kind of liked them. It took risks with character development, which I think paid off, especially the risks they took with Walt. I learned a lot about chemistry from watching the series. Anytime a series like that can also be educational, I think that's a good thing. It showed the dark side of substance use and more serious substance-related crime. So the show really didn't make any effort to glorify this particular type of criminal activity, this particular type of life. Now we see in the series a few slow episodes, but nothing that really offsets the brilliance of the show. I think the one that stands out, as I mentioned before, was the episode with the fly. But it does actually contribute to understanding Walt. So it wasn't necessarily bad for that. It was just kind of boring compared to the other episodes. I hope that this particular show kind of inspires other writers to take chances, especially as it relates to mental health, personality, and the changes that occur in relationships. So I know whenever I analyze fictional characters, there will always be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They're sure to generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the Walter White character in Breaking Bad to be interesting. Thanks for watching.